This event is hosted jointly by SCVO and Liberty, and we're delighted to have Shami Chakrabarti, Director of Liberty, here to speak to us. Shami's going to give us some comments, an overview of the situation of human rights as she sees it. We're then going to have an open discussion with our panel members, who I'll hold off introducing until we get going because we're running a little bit behind. But just before Shami gives us her comments, just to give you a flavour, Shami first joined Liberty the day before the 9/11 attacks in 2001 and was appointed director 2 years later. And since then, under her leadership, the organisation has seen off attempts to impose compulsory ID cards, disrupted plans to extend the pre-charge detention to 42 days, defeated the internment of foreign nationals, challenged the divisive stop and search without suspicion powers, something we've seen arise in Scotland in recent years, and just late last year, or early this year, sorry, announced that you were leaving Liberty after 12 years at the helm. But work is far from done. Shami continues to lead Liberty's campaigns, especially on the fight against the government's plans to scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with a weaker Bill of Rights. So please join me in welcoming Shami Chakrabarti.
Well, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here in Scotland again. I seem to be here more often than not these days. It could be that the suspicious amongst you might think that I'm preparing my asylum application. And yes, it's true. I did start at Liberty the day before 9/11, but please don't think I'm a Jonah. Please don't get too uncomfortable in your seats. Though it has to be said that some years ago, the Sun newspaper did call me the most dangerous woman in Britain. And you can imagine how I dined out on that particular description for many years. It was particularly helpful when you went to the great city of Liverpool, where you could get a standing ovation without even speaking. But of course, the Daily Mail newspaper had to spoil my fun during last year's general election campaign and award that title to a certain charismatic politician that we heard from in the earlier session. And to add insult to injury, the First Minister is a little bit younger than I am as well. So this is what happened. It comes to all of us. We were talking about the ageing population. It comes to all of us. You know, when you're young, it starts being the gymnasts or the footballers who are younger than you, and then it's the policemen and the doctors and the school teachers, and then you get to my age, and it's the Prime Ministers too. But more seriously, it was a great pleasure to hear the First Minister talking about the challenges for the sector. And I should also say that Nicola Sturgeon has been a great defender of the Human Rights Act. Despite all the many challenges in human rights in the United Kingdom at the moment and in the wider world, let's make no mistake, the existential threat to human rights protection in all of our islands, in all of our countries, is the Westminster government's plan, promise, pledge to scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with a so-called British Bill of Rights and Responsibility. Sometimes they add with common sense. And when these titles get a little too long, it's time to get a bit nervous. And when politicians add common sense to something that's really simple, human rights for human beings, not citizens' privileges, not Scottish rights or English rights or French rights or American rights. We know where that kind of thinking leads. It is the road to Guantanamo Bay, quite simply, where it is permissible to treat some people in an inhuman way because they are not your own nationals and possibly because it's offshore. And the First Minister has been absolutely unequivocal in a speech here in Glasgow last autumn that she and her party, both in Scotland and in Westminster, will defend the Human Rights Act for all the people in the United Kingdom. So on that, she's been very importantly a universalist and an internationalist. And we're very grateful for that, because without that very strong commitment from the political community in Scotland and your representatives in Westminster, we can't say the Human Rights Act, which you know is completely embedded into the devolution arrangements, not just in Scotland, but also in Northern Ireland, where there is equally a very limited, to say the least, appetite for a so-called British Bill of Rights. And just to remind you of what has been suggested and mooted by the Westminster government, it's been essentially suggested first that this is British, i.e. it should protect nationals and not non-nationals. So less, if any, real protection, for example, for asylum seekers. And we know where that leads, don't we? It leads to people washed up on Mediterranean beaches in the 21st century, something that I never thought I would see. It is suggested that this so-called British Bill of Rights ought not to touch the MOD. And this, of course, would be very relevant to young men and women in Scotland too, serving in the armed forces, who would not get the protection that they currently get from the Human Rights Act. And this is one of the biggest and loudest arguments that's made by Conservative politicians for scrapping the Human Rights Act. It protects all humans over there, over here, anywhere where the writ runs, and it protects Iraqis in detention, but it also protects young British servicemen and women who put themselves in harm's way at the behest of our political leaders. So I think that's very important. It's suggested that the British Bill of Rights will protect good people and not bad people. Decent, have you heard that phrase? Decent, law-abiding people? Because so much of our politics in recent years and decades has been about this distinction between the worthy and the unworthy, particularly amongst the poor. Began under New Labour, you know that whole discourse, ASBOs, CRASBOs, mosquitoes, the worthy and the unworthy poor. In house number one, it's perfect family, you know, not very wealthy, but they do their best, and the kids always go off to school and to cello practice with their hair perfectly brushed. Next door, the hoodies from hell. Divide and rule. So it's suggested that somehow this British Bill of Rights will make a distinction between good and bad people, those worthy and those unworthy of protection. And you will know that a lot of the debate about not just the Human Rights Act, but about the UK's continuing membership of the Council of Europe, it's not the EU now, but also our signatory status to the European Convention on Human Rights. A lot of the row around that concerns prisoner voting. So prisoners, convicted criminals who for a period of time are incarcerated, have been demonised in political discourse over a number of years, just as foreign nationals and refugees and asylum seekers in particular have been demonised. And this is a great way of toxifying the debate around human rights, which are, of course, for everyone, human rights for human beings. And it's also suggested that the courts should have less power over the Westminster government in any new British Bill of Rights. And here the Westminster government is slightly fickle about whether they're just having a pop at the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, or whether they're also attacking the Supreme Court in Westminster, and indeed courts in Scotland and elsewhere in the kingdom where human rights are adjudicated. When it suits them, our Prime Minister and Home Secretary will literally attack all judges. They talk about feeling physically sick at the determinations of quote-unquote unelected judges, in particular when they say that some prisoners perhaps ought to have the vote. So I was very touched by the discussion earlier when someone mentioned the difficulty that young people with criminal convictions have even being able to to volunteer as a pathway back into society and into the workforce. We've got to, I think, in our sector be absolutely clear that we're trying to be inclusive, we're trying to help people who can't otherwise be helped. And this divide and rule, this worthy and unworthy distinction is particularly difficult for those who have been in the criminal justice system. And finally, it's suggested that this new British Bill of Rights will somehow make a distinction between cases that are worthy of examination and adjudication and so-called trivial cases. And my question is, who decides? What is a trivial violation of human rights, I ask myself. I think maybe Rosa Parks should have just got over herself and gone to the back of the bus, don't you? And who decides what is trivial? And I'm not being flippant, actually, with the Rosa Parks analysis. Often, it's discrimination that is seen as trivial by those who aren't in the discriminated against category, right? So it is Rosa Parks and the back of the bus. It is a gay couple turned away from a bed and breakfast, etc., etc., etc. There's something very special about discrimination that makes it particularly degrading beyond what it would feel like to not get access to that product or that service or that courtesy if you didn't feel it was on account of a characteristic that you have. And so again, the suggestion that politicians will decide what is and isn't a trivial violation of human rights is, I think, something that we all need to be incredibly concerned about. So you appreciate why I say that saving the Human Rights Act and keeping the UK in the Convention on Human Rights is absolutely essential, not just for people in Britain and people in Scotland, but also because of the signal that relinquishing that set of values would send to the rest of the world. And there are people elsewhere in the Council of Europe who have even made impassioned speeches at the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg about the signal it would send, for example, to Putin's Russia and elsewhere in wider Europe if Britain were to turn its back on the post-World War II human rights settlement. So you'll appreciate why it's so important to be in Scotland yet again and to seek the solidarity and continued commitment of civil society here to protecting the Act and the values within it. Now, I was told to provoke a discussion on what a fairer Scotland looks like. And that seems like an absolute impertinence that I should come to Scotland and suggest to you what a fairer Scotland should look like. So I don't want to address it in quite that way. Safe to say, with the example that the First Minister has sent to politicians elsewhere in the kingdom in relation to human rights, comes some responsibility. You know, the fact that we are now all over the kingdom, and no doubt elsewhere in the world, now looking to Scotland to see what a human rights-based society, what greater social justice could look like, does mean that, that you're being watched. And so your aspirations become completely interconnected with the aspirations of people elsewhere, conducting thought experiments. Could England be better? Could England be fairer too? Is it possible to lift people's aspirations and return to values of greater solidarity and so on? So I would like to just provoke a discussion from a human rights perspective, because so much of what I heard in the first session about the challenges and the aspirations that you face here completely chimed with me. But the question is it possible to use human rights thinking to help negotiate some of the difficult terrain that you all face, whether in campaigning and advocacy, because you're still allowed to do it up here, right? Or whether in service provision. Because I don't say that the Human Rights Act or the values within it are a computer program or a magic spell that will solve every problem. Of course course it's not like that, but they are a framework to help negotiate some difficult challenges and public policy tensions. That's what I think. Article 2 of the Convention, as you know, is the right to life. That, of course, is not everlasting life. For that, you need medics or clerics, not legal drafting. But it is the right to positive protection of life, and indeed the right to prompt and independent investigations into untimely death. Down in Surrey, in recent weeks, we've seen the beginning of the Deep Cut inquest. Goodness me, it's been a long time coming, and that would not be possible but for the positive obligation in the Human Rights Act to independent investigation of untimely death. And there have been other military cases like that where mysterious deaths, allegedly following bullying, suicide or not, mysterious deaths within the MOD estate, if I can put it that way, have been brushed under the carpet, and it's only the Human Rights Act that has allowed those new inquests to take place. And so I just suggest to you, do you think that there is adequate service provision for protecting vulnerable people in custody, whether it's police custody or care, in Scotland? And do you think there are adequate resources for the investigation, adequate provision for the investigation of untimely death? I ask the question, I don't give the answer, because I don't think that is my place. Article 3 of the Convention is the right not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment or torture. Now, of course, this conjures immediately images of people in Guantanamo, or people who've been rendered, people who've been subject to the CIA's more nefarious programs in the War on Terror, but it's so much more than that. This is the article of the Convention that means that women in England no longer face cross-examination in person by the man who they say raped them. This is the provision that has forced countries all over Europe to revisit the law of sex offences and the provision for vulnerable women and children who've been subject to abuse. And you know, human rights to thrive and survive can't just live in a courtroom. They have to thrive and survive in the living room and the classroom and the police station and the Parliament chamber and so on. And so I think we particularly need to look to the home and to health and social care settings when we're deciding whether people are being cared for and are able to live with dignity in our various countries. And so when I think of the greater challenges that Article 3 presents us with in the 21st century world, I'm thinking about domestic abuse, and I'm thinking about some of the indignities at the end of life, in particular in the home or in social care settings. Article 4 is the right not to be enslaved. That might seem completely irrelevant in the early part of the 21st century, but that's not quite so. Did you know that until 2010, we didn't actually have a criminal offence of holding someone as a slave? The slave trade had been notionally abolished hundreds of years before, and yes, false imprisonment was a crime, and threats and violence and so on were a crime. But certainly under English law, there was no criminal offence of holding someone as a slave until we at Liberty brought challenges to police forces for not protecting people who were in domestic servitude, for example, often trafficked people. The door was not locked, but they were afraid of their passports not being returned to them. They were afraid of deportation. They were afraid of consequences for their loved ones far away if they spoke against a notional employer who had just never paid them for years in some cases. And there is slavery in reality in the UK, in agricultural settings, in sex work settings, in domestic servitude settings. And there are people with learning difficulties and other vulnerable people who are effectively enslaved. Now, that's certainly the case in England and Wales. It's not for me to suggest that it is the case in Scotland, but you will know better than me whether those situations still arise. And also, we want to think of human rights not just as negative prohibitions on ill treatment. We want to think of them as aspirational values, and we want to think of standards that can be improved. And so when you're thinking about the living wage for care workers, when you're thinking about pathways from volunteering into remunerated work, and frankly, when we're thinking about the care that is provided by people in the home, particularly by women, and often by children and young people, for siblings, for older people and sick people, can't we aspire in the not too distant future to start remunerating people who do so much of that care completely unpaid? I don't know. Maybe that's too aspirational, but I hope not one day. Article 5 of the Convention, as you know, is the right not to be arbitrarily detained, not to be detained without law and proper checks and balances and review. And I think this is still a massive problem with asylum seekers, many of them women, detained for lengthy periods of time, which can be incredibly damaging for people who've already been so damaged in other parts of the world, who then come and are damaged all over again. Certainly in England, at the notorious Yarl's Wood Detention Centre, there are women who have been the victims of rape and torture elsewhere in the world, who then come and find themselves monitored 24 hours a day by male guards. What does that feel like? And no proper detention limits at all. Still fighting for detention limits in the House of Lords with an immigration bill that's currently going through. But also, when we're talking about arbitrary detention, what about older people and vulnerable people and those with mental health problems who are sometimes cared for and sometimes detained, and sometimes there is a fine line between the two? And what are we doing as a third sector? What are we doing either as campaigners or as service providers to interrogate that line between care and detention? Particularly, it can be a very blurred line, particularly I think with older people. Article 6 is the right to a fair trial, as you know, but for it to be real, it's not just about the courtroom. It's about whether people in all our countries have real access to advice and representation regardless of their means. You will know better than me what you think the scale of the provision of legal advice and representation is in Scotland, but I tell you, in England, it's a pretty poor show. I was proud to grow up, as I'm sure most of you were, in a country with an NHS, where if you were knocked over in the street, as I once was as a child, you would be scraped up and taken to the emergency room regardless of your means. But I was also proud to grow up in a country where if something bad was going to happen to you, whether it's losing contact with your children or your home, or being deported from the country, or having problems at work, possibly even losing your job, the list goes on, you would get access to advice and representation regardless of your means. That simply is no longer the case. Civil legal aid is all but dead in England and Wales, and without it, the laws are a dead letter in a sealed book. Now, my understanding is that things are a bit better in Scotland, but how much better? And are they good enough? And do the vulnerable people that so many of you advocate for and care for get the legal advice and representation that they need? And then, of course, Article 9, freedom of thought, conscience and religion. I'm into sensitive territory, perhaps, now. Of course, that is the right to the faith of your choice. That is the right to no faith whatsoever, and there are still people in the world who have faith forced upon them. But I think perhaps most importantly of all, it is the right to be a heretic within any faith community, to be, I don't know, the gay Muslim, the woman that wants to be a bishop, or the Sikh woman who some years ago in Birmingham wrote a play called Beshti about rape within her community, and the mob appeared at the Birmingham Rep, and the police and other authorities just counselled those who put on the play that they, for the good of public order, better shut it down. And I guess the woman who wrote that play was a heretic, but what does it do to thinking and to freedom and to progress if heresy is shut down in that way? Now, what is freedom of conscience like in Scotland? It's not for me to say it. Scotland's becoming a bit like Sweden in terms of those of us, bourgeois liberals down in London looking up, going, "Oh, it must be better in Scotland. Must be better in Sweden." Is it? I don't know. You will know better than me. And then, of course, free speech. Article 10 of the Convention, the lifeblood of any democracy. And yet, our government in Westminster is introducing anti-advocacy clauses, is telling schools and universities under its so-called prevent agenda who should and shouldn't be able to speak on campus and how this should all be monitored, etc., etc. And sometimes this is part of an anti-extremism agenda, but I think if it is, it's completely counterproductive. It's also counterproductive, I think, when I get occasional emails and notes from various student unions in England, I should say, for the most part, telling me not to go and speak on a particular campus because some objectionable person or other has spoken there. Or a really good one that I got last term from a very nice young woman's officer at her university, asking me to reconsider my acceptance of an invitation to speak on her campus. She asked me not to attend because that university doesn't have enough women speaking. Seriously. It was a very charming and polite note. I wrote back to her and said I would be going to speak, and I asked her to reconsider her position from a feminist perspective, because I thought it was sort of the equivalent of asking every woman in the House of Commons and any candidate for election to the House of Commons, say at the 2020 election, to boycott the election because there aren't enough women represented in politics. So I think there are issues of free speech is so important. We need to protect it, and students need to not give away what government wants to take from them. There is no such thing, in my view, as no platform in the internet age, just closed and narrow platforms where hate goes unchallenged. Better for it to be challenged, in my view. Now, I've deliberately parked until now Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life and correspondence, because I think it is becoming just so very important. On the street, for young men in particular, it's about stop and search, which is a very, very blunt instrument, which in my view has always done more harm than good, has always alienated more young men in particular than it has detected or prevented crime. And I know that there are some attempts to tighten up the use of that practice in Scotland, and I just urge you all to monitor that progress with great vigilance, because it's a very divisive tool, and I've seen it go very, very wrong in England over a number of years. And yes, the powers can be tightened up and must be tightened up so that they're not just under the common law, that they are all statutory, and they should be suspicion-based and not more blanket, but also the use has to be very, very carefully monitored if whole generations of young men aren't to be alienated from society before they've ever entered it. But it's also now incredibly important to think about privacy in the internet age. This is possibly the new frontier of civil liberties debate in the 21st century. And the investigatory powers bill that's currently being considered in the Westminster Parliament is a threat, in my view, a huge threat, not just to the privacy, but to the cyber security of everyone in the UK and way beyond. the powers that are proposed in that piece of draft legislation that has now been criticised by at least 3 different parliamentary bodies are breathtaking. They're nothing short of breathtaking in their blanket reach. This is draft legislation that follows Edward Snowden's revelations. Now, some people call him a villain, and some people call him a hero or a whistleblower, and guess what? I'm in the second camp. And whether you agree with me or with Mrs. May on the precise balance between privacy and surveillance, surely we have to agree that this should not have gone on for so many years without public knowledge, let alone debate, let alone political or legal consent. And finally, the key to the human rights kingdom, Article 14, equal treatment under the law. We lawyers, or recovering lawyers, or whatever it is I am, perhaps I'm in remission, I don't know. We lawyers call it the principle of non-discrimination or equal treatment, but I think we humans call it empathy. And I think so much of what I heard in the first panel this morning and the challenges of younger people and older people and vulnerable people and people who have been in trouble with the law and all these people in the different groups that you advocate for and represent and look after would benefit so much if we really practiced empathy. It's a human value to be found in all the great traditions of this planet. Walking around in someone else's shoes, treating other people as you'd like to be treated. I like to think of human rights as just loving other people's children and not just your own. So I've tried to set out these various enumerated rights and freedoms, but ultimately I think we can sum up human rights thinking with 3 words. Dignity. Every single one of us is precious just because we're alive, not because of our nationality or our gender or our sexuality or our race or so on, just because we're alive. Equality, as in empathy, non-hypocrisy, equal treatment, and fairness. Dignity, equality, fairness. Those would be the values that any society built on human rights and the rule of law would recognise. But I suppose the greatest of these is equality. And I do think, just to echo the earlier panel this morning, I think that we've got real issues with gender injustice, not just in Scotland or the UK, but I think it's probably the greatest injustice on the planet that touches first world, developing world. It's almost like an apartheid, but one that doesn't exist just in one country for one moment. It is global and millennial. I think gender injustice is the biggest on the planet. But also, increasingly, we've got issues of generational justice. And yes, of course, we must take better care of ourselves and each other in old age because there's going to be more of it. But some of those people who are going to experience that more and more difficult old age are actually a generation below me. Now, with the exception of the young First Minister, and she is a notable and sparkling exception, I am rather disappointed in my generation of the political class. I went to university on a full grant with no tuition fees, and you still have better provision for education in the young in Scotland, I know. But I do worry about the young. They didn't warm the planet. They didn't crunch the credit. They didn't start the wars, the real wars, or the metaphysical wars over here or over there, but they are probably going to have to work longer, harder, for less remuneration and more taxation. And I think that bearing all of that in mind, we need to treat them with greater compassion in every walk of life right now. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Shami. I think particularly struck by our British rights different from human rights, but also setting out, I think, the characteristics that we should seek to identify in a fairer Scotland. And whether it's prisoner voting, death in custody, Scotland is not immune from any of these threats to the universal provision of human rights. And I think taking up that suggestion of seeing human rights as a aspirational value rather than a set of prohibitions may be an opportunity just to turn the conversation slightly. What I want to do, I'm going to introduce the other members of the panel, but invite you all to come and ask questions, make brief statements. We've got about just over 15 minutes to go. You'll see there's microphones with numbers at the front of the stage here. If you form an orderly queue, don't all rush at once. As you do that, I'll invite some of the panel members just to give some responses, especially I think just taking up that challenge I think from Shami to say, what are those characteristics of a fairer Scotland, using a human rights thinking to make them a reality. So on my left, I have Amy Dalrymple, Head of Policy at Alzheimer's Scotland. I have on my right, Shabam Begum from the Scottish Independence Advocacy Alliance, and Ian Gordon from Bethany Christian Trust. Amy, can I start with you? Thinking of your client group with the Alzheimer's, particularly vulnerable people, not always able to be heard, how can a fairer Scotland use a human rights framework to advance their rights?
Thanks, Gordon. And first of all, thank you, Shami, for a very thought-provoking and inspiring run-through there of how all the articles affect us very practically. At Alzheimer's Scotland, we've been taking a human rights-based approach to what we're advocating in terms of service provision and our advocacy in terms of involvement of people with dementia and carers in the decisions that affect their lives since 2009, really, and the publication of the Charter of Rights, for which I must give credit to the members of the Scottish Parliament who were on that cross-party group who worked in partnership with Alzheimer's Scotland to come up with that. That Charter of Rights didn't come up with any new rights for people with dementia and carers, but it drew on the Human Rights Act, and it drew on the UN Charter of Rights of People with Disabilities as well, to describe what rights in particular affect people with dementia and carers. And it's been a real solid platform, a real solid basis for the progress that we've been able to make in Scotland in terms of tackling the stigma faced by people with dementia, the stigma faced by carers, and I think that relates back to Shami's points earlier about who is worthy or who is not worthy of human rights, which is a danger in the current UK government discussion. And it's also in terms of what rights, what people ought to be able to expect in terms of the care that they receive, the support that they receive. And I'm not saying we've not got a long way to go. And anyone who has a relative or somebody they know affected by dementia will know that we still have a long way to go in terms of making progress and making care better and making support better. But we have been enabled to make concrete progress in service provision, in hospitals, in care homes, in care at home, because of using a human rights basis. And I'm proud to be able to say that Scotland is seen, kind of worldwide as a world leader in that. And just one more part of that, because I know we've not got long, is about the involvement of people with dementia and carers in making those decisions. That aspect has been firmly based on human rights, and that is something where Scotland really is a world leader, really has led the world in terms of that self-advocacy there. And dementia would not be a Scottish government priority, as it has been since 2010, without that human rights-based approach and without that involvement of people with dementia and carers in the advocacy that we're trying to channel in Alzheimer's Scotland. So thanks, really appreciate this opportunity to bring those together.
Chairman, taking up the issue of advocacy, and maybe thinking, as Amy says, some of the policy framework is maybe pretty strong, maybe not always where we would like it, but when it comes to the practical day-to-day way in which institutions respond to the rights of individuals, especially those less able to make their own case, what's been your experience of that in Scotland?
Well, I think that it was really, I felt really positive when Shami used the word aspirational. Advocacy organisations work every day throughout Scotland to safeguard the rights of people on a really, really basic level. Sometimes it's about things like housing, it's about helping people access food banks. It's about helping people to access services, whether that's mental health services or other services. And so sometimes it's on a really, really basic level, but actually advocacy is about broadening people's horizons, it's about aspirations, it's about helping people fulfill their wishes and desires, the things that you and I might dream about, traveling the world, going to live in Australia or whatever, that we never actually do, but we're entitled to have those dreams because we are who we are. But lots of people with disabilities in Scotland don't have those kind of lives. Their lives are really, really confined. I thought that your point about detention, and we have lots and lots of cases in Scotland where there's de facto detention, where people, there isn't any legislation that confines them to the places that they live in. But because we've got policies, we've got procedures, we've got infrastructures, we've got attitudes, and we've got sort of cultures and behaviours within services, within health and social care services, that restrict people's lives. And I'm not saying that people who work in health and social care are fundamentally bad. You know, the third sector provides lots and lots of services, and people don't come into the health and social care world to be bad, to infringe people's rights, to not uphold their human rights, and to undermine the Human Rights Act. But actually we've got systems in place that mean that people can't behave in a compassionate way because there's things that need to be done, there's policies that need to be followed. We've got a long, long way to go, as Amy said. I think that Scotland's a fabulous place to live in. Scotland is really, really fair. If you fit a certain demographic, if you don't fit that demographic, then actually it's quite a harsh place to live in. I'm not comparing it to any other place. I'm not saying, you know, it's worse or whatever. But actually, I think that if you fit a certain demographic of privilege, of ethnicity, of gender, of sexuality, then actually it's fabulous. And if you don't, there's lots and lots of barriers, there's lots of obstacles, there's lots of discrimination, rights not upheld. The recent report by the Equality and Human Rights Commission about is Scotland a fairer place to live, that doesn't make for positive reading. And lots of our members deal with those kind of issues on an everyday basis.
Ian, thinking of the role the Bethany Christian Trust plays every day, you know, making provision for people missed out often by the state to the private sector, how do you see a human rights framework working for you and your team?
I think it's essential if we're going to be successful at the work we do. I was really struck as well when Shami was talking about British rights versus other rights, and we're very good at othering people. Sometimes, you know, the disabled, the unemployed, the old, or in our case, very often, the homeless. And othering people is a very good way of making people not us. So they're not one of us. They don't need to be treated like one of us. We'll look after us. And I loved when Shami was talking about, you know, the 3 principles of human rights. And for me, it's almost even simpler saying that human rights is about selflessness rather than selfishness. And if we're going to become a more human rights-based society, then, you know, we're going to have to change our behaviour. And if we're going to change our behaviour, we need to look to the values that drive that behaviour. And remember a couple of years ago, we were looking at what values do we want to see in an independent Scotland. But we've lost that conversation now. But if we don't focus on the values that we want as a society, we're not going to see the behaviour we want. And just one other thing, talking about worthy and unworthy, very often the people we work with are considered the unworthy, the skivers as opposed to the strivers, and particularly people who are seen to be sleeping rough or begging. And one of the services we operate is a night shelter for people who do sleep rough. And because of sanctions and other issues at the moment, it's the busiest year we've ever had, over 120% increase over the last couple of years. And because of that, we're full most nights. And recently, speaking to the people running the service and saying we were full, people were being turned away at the door. But there are a couple inside who knew it was a bad night, knew the weather was bad, and the people waiting outside had poorer health than they had. So they went outside so that people inside could get a bed. That, for me, sums up a selfless, less selfish approach. And these were people who themselves had been denied human rights to a home, to food, to employment, to fair representation, yet they were willing to give up what they had that night to benefit others. And I think if we're going to become a fairer society, that's the attitude we should all have. We're saying loving other people's children as well as our own. It's loving other people before ourselves and putting their interests ahead of our own.
Thank you. This is your opportunity to have your say. Please do come forward. The microphones are just here. You want to come forward? Shami, just while people come forward, is there potentially a risk? I think you were very, very astutely avoiding being too prescriptive with us here in Scotland. But is there perhaps a risk that we get a little bit complacent in Scotland, that it's not as bad, the threats in here are not as bad as the kind of totemic changes to legislation that appear to be on the table in England and Wales, and that we maybe overlook some of the systemic failings that can creep in? I
think complacency is always a risk. You know, in the UK, complacency has been has been a problem for a long time, which is now why we're facing the threat that we do to the Human Rights Act. And of course, it's great to hear the First Minister say, "I'm not going to shut down debate. We need the third sector to be the grit and the oyster, etc., etc." But of course, there is an inevitable risk when you have a great charismatic Prime Minister with a big majority, etc., etc. Anyway, so of course, civil society becomes more important than ever, and we can't just talk about human rights. We have to be really self-critical, as we've heard.
Just introduce who you are and where you're from. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lucy Keane, and I work for the Trussell Trust, who partner with churches and communities to launch food banks. We have 50 in Scotland currently. And I'm just interested in the panel's thoughts on the right to food and enshrining that in law. We're constantly challenged that we should be the first people out of a job, which we agree with, but unfortunately, because of various factors, food banks provide a vital service to people in crisis across Scotland and across the UK at the moment. I'm interested in what the panel think about when people get to a point of crisis and they feel, often people tell me they feel their rights have been stripped away to the point where they're left with bare cupboards. So I'm just wondering on your thoughts about that.
So, maybe if I could expand that even slightly further, there are other rights perhaps that were not fully covered in the Human Rights Act, right to a home, right to work. Shami?
So the Human Rights Act deals for the most part with civil and political rights. But you're quite right, you need social and economic rights because human rights are about protecting everything that you need to be a human and to not just to survive, but hopefully to thrive as a human as well. So the Universal Declaration has, which is not a legal document, it is just a visionary, aspirational document, protected both the social and the economic rights to food and housing and so on, and the civil and political rights to speech and privacy and conscience and so on. Now, in Britain, in post-war Britain, the social and economic rights were ultimately supposed to be protected by the welfare state. And then the European Convention, is what you've got for your speech and your conscience and so on. And it seems to me that in modern Britain, both are undermined. I grew up in the 80s, and I don't remember seeing food banks. I live in central London in a very mixed, what they call a mixed part of town, right? So posh houses with MPs and barristers and tower blocks. And there is a food bank across the road from my house. I never thought I would see that. So yes, it is a terrible indignity that people are being subjected to all over the United Kingdom, and I just don't want us to get too comfortable with it. Now, I understand the need for emergency food banks for a period of time, but if that period of time goes on for too long, whether it's in lovely Scotland or whether it's in horrible England or however you want to, food banks are an abomination. And we need to, yes, do the provision as an emergency, but the emergency cannot go on forever because that is not an emergency anymore. That is a new normal, as to quote Mr. Rumsfeld.
Yes, covering.
My name's Ian Shaw, and I'm the Director of Media Education. And for me, there's what could we do to promote human rights for a fairer Scotland? And I think that we have massive capability in terms of communications. And I think that's a thing that we can be going forward with in a more systematic way. We have social media, we have local third sector media going, we've got mass media. And I think that it's about that organizing of that media in a more systematic way in order to really help people to present and become more visible to power. And I think that when we talk about rights, we need to be talking about the defending of rights, of the reinforcement of those rights, of the reminder of those rights. And I think that's where I think that we can be using communication, and we have massive power as ordinary people to do that now. And that's my point.
Thank you. About the next speaker, just to say, I think a very strong point there. SCVO, today's event really is is not meant to be the end of this conversation. SCVO will be coming out over the next few weeks and months to engage with members and across the third sector to see how we can build the confidence of the third sector in Scotland to promote human rights and specifically the rights of the people that third sector organisations work with. And I think there will be more opportunities to get that kind of active voice going. Yes.
Hello, my name's Liam Beattie. I work for HIV Scotland. I was wondering whether the panel thinks that at present people actually fully understand the implications of scrapping the Human Rights Act, and more so if they feel that people can actually fully understand how to use their human rights on a day-to-day basis. I think that within this room right now we've got a lot of policy experts who have a really good understanding of how human rights can be used across a range of services, but whether the panel feel that the average person in the street actually understands how to use them or not.
I'm going to use this question to allow people to wind up. I think that's a good point to end the session on. So I'll start with Ian and then end with Shami, if I can ask you to be quite brief, as with people queuing for the next session.
Okay, brief, no. I don't think on average people do know what will be the outcome of scrapping the Human Rights Act, and only be about 5 or 10 years later at the most, when people realise the things that they took for granted in our complacency, as Shami was talking about, are no longer there, and by then it'll be too late to do anything about it. And taking up the last speaker's point, we've got a duty, those of us who do understand, to try to help as many people who don't understand to do so as quickly as we possibly can.
I would agree. I think that people don't really understand the implications, but I think we live in a society where lots of people don't really understand their rights and don't have the confidence to demand their rights. So that, this is part of a bigger issue, I think.
I would obviously agree with the previous two speakers, but we can do things about that. If you are interested, you can go and download the Standards of Care for People with Dementia in Scotland, which is admittedly imperfect. We need to do some revision on what it actually looks like, but it's a rights-based approach. It's explaining what I can expect if I have dementia from services, and it expresses it in the language of rights, and it relates it to rights, and it talks about the Human Rights Act. There are ways that we can do this, and I know that SCVO is going to be doing this work. I think, as individual organisations, those of us here in this room, we can do a lot. We're there in communities. We're working with people who need these rights, and so there's such a lot that we can do to link up what it is that we're trying to achieve, the social aims we're trying to achieve, with what underlines them, which is human rights.
Well, once more, thank you all for listening and for your solidarity. No, I don't think people know what they have to lose. To quote, the great Joni Mitchell, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you had till it's gone? And that is how people would feel, I think, if the Human Rights Act is scrapped or diluted, which is what's planned. But I do think that you've got a great opportunity here, because the First Minister said, well, it's a small country, it's only 5 million people, but only 5 million people that unite around something as important as human rights values can be very, very powerful. And of course, all of you could be great leaders and educators in your sectors and with your stakeholder groups and your client groups, in educating them about their rights and freedoms. And hopefully the example will filter south as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, can you join me in thanking our panel, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.